The Queen smiled. Anne Boleyn, bold, radiant, untouchable. England watched her like a flame, some with awe, some with fear, some waiting for her to burn. At the joust in Greenwich, she sat high above the crowd, a symbol of grace and power. A knight rode past. Anne dropped her handkerchief, an old gesture of favor. Innocent, traditional, but deadly. Henry VIII saw it. He didn't speak, didn't blink, just stood and walked out. The cheers kept going, but something had broken. Not the handkerchief, the illusion. Behind the velvet curtains of court, whispers turned into plans, loyalty turned into fear. And Thomas Cromwell, the king's cold right hand, stepped forward. He had been watching Anne for months, waiting, listening, collecting, not evidence, permission. Because power didn't need proof. It only needed silence. From the right people. Anne had made enemies. Too smart, too proud, too foreign, too independent. The nobles resented her. The churchmen blamed her. And Henry, he no longer loved her. Worse, he no longer needed her. She had given him a daughter, but not the son he craved. And now, a new woman smiled at the king. Jane Seymour. Soft, obedient, convenient. The Queen's throne felt colder, and her footsteps louder. Every ally she once had now looked away. That night, Anne dined in royal chambers. The silver gleamed. The torches flickered, but something was missing. Henry. She asked where he was. No one answered. The walls had ears, and those ears reported to Cromwell. Plans had been written, accusations prepared, names forged, loyalty sold. Anne went to sleep as queen, but fate didn't rest. It sharpened its knives, and by the next sunrise, the Queen of England was no longer free. She was prey. Justice is a slow hammer, unless it's already been swung. Behind closed doors, May 2nd, 1536. The Queen is smiling at court. By nightfall, she is under arrest. Adultery, incest, high treason. 3 charges. 1 purpose, destruction. They didn't need proof. They needed permission. And Cromwell had it. Henry had already signed the order. Before the trial, before the charges, before the Queen even knew she was accused, the trial would come. But the outcome was already sealed in wax. Cromwell moved fast. He had names, some real, some made up. He needed a confession, so he made one. Mark Smeaton, a court musician, tied to the rack, tortured, broken. After 24 hours, he said what they wanted. I slept with the Queen. He never stood a chance. He wasn't noble. He was disposable. 4 others were accused. All men, all close to Anne. One of them, her own brother, George Boleyn. Think about that. They accused her of incest, to make sure she couldn't be saved. George denied it. So did the others. But it didn't matter. Cromwell had timelines, fake ones, made to fit the lie. They said Anne slept with a man in Greenwich, on a day she was in Richmond, 10 miles away. Royal records proved it. Still, they kept writing, kept building, because the truth had no place in this story. Only obedience did. Even Anne's enemies doubted it. Eustace Chapuys, the Imperial Ambassador. He hated Anne, but even he wrote to the Emperor. These charges are based on presumption and nothing more. But hatred wasn't the fuel here. Power was. Henry wanted her gone, and Cromwell made it happen. The Queen was now the enemy, and the tower awaited. Behind its stone walls, Anne waited, paced, prayed. She asked for answers. None came, only silence and spies. Every word she spoke was reported. Every sigh, every cry, every prayer. She asked about George. She didn't know. He was in another cell, waiting to die. She asked about her father. He had vanished. To protect himself, to survive the king. No one stood for her. Not family, Not friends. Not the crown she once wore. The trap had worked. The charges were paper. But the fear was real. And fear is louder than facts. Because even the lies weren't meant to prove her guilt. They were designed to crush her soul. They didn't throw her in a dungeon. They didn't chain her in the dark. They did something worse. They locked her in the same rooms where she was once crowned queen. Same bed, same tapestries, same golden windows. But now, no crown, no music, no hope. Sir William Kingston, Constable of the Tower, wrote in his letter. She asked me, "Shall I go into a dungeon?" I said, "No, madam. You shall go where you slept as queen." She laughed, a loud, strange laugh. Not joy, not madness. It was the sound of something breaking. Every hour, Anne walked in circles, back and forth, over the same stones, over the same past. She prayed, cried, laughed again, then wept. It wasn't silence that tortured her. It was memory. She remembered the trumpets, the coronation, the promises. Now, only whispers remained, whispers that watched. 4 ladies in waiting were placed with her. But they weren't friends. They were spies. One of them, Lady Kingston, wife of the constable himself. Their job was to listen, to watch, to write down everything. Her dreams, her tears, her words in prayer. Anne spoke often, too often. She was trying to understand. "What have I done?" she asked. "Why am I here?" No one answered. She offered her own body, to be examined, to prove her innocence. That's how far she'd fallen. From Queen of England to pleading for a physical inspection. Time slowed. But pain didn't. It changed. Hope became the cruelest knife. They told her the execution would be soon, then delayed it. Again and again. She prepared her soul. For May 18th, she spent the whole night awake, crying, praying, ready. Then sunrise came, and nothing happened. No footsteps, no priest, no sword, only more waiting. Kingston wrote, "She seemed very desirous to be executed. Let that settle." She wanted it to be over, because death now felt like mercy. But mercy was not in fashion. She asked again, "Where is my brother?" No reply. She whispered her father's name. No answer. She didn't know. George was in the tower too, just walls away. And her father had already walked away to save himself. Anne Boleyn, once the flame of England, was now alone. Completely, utterly alone. Surrounded not by friends, but watchers and whispers and the ghost of who she used to be. It wasn't a courtroom. It was a stage. Not for justice, but for performance. On May 15th, Anne Boleyn stood trial, not as a queen, but as an example of what happens when power is questioned. No lawyer, no defense, no chance. She wasn't told the full charges until the trial began. She wasn't allowed to call witnesses, or speak in full, or breathe without judgment. The jury, handpicked, stacked with enemies. Her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presided, and would soon speak the words that ended her life. Among the jurors, Charles Brandon, who once called her a goggle-eyed whore. Henry Percy, the man Anne once loved, but was forced to leave. And the most haunting of all, relatives of Jane Seymour. Yes, Jane, the woman Henry would marry. Just 11 days after Anne's execution. This wasn't justice. It was rehearsal. And now, the twist. While Anne stood in court, defending her life, Henry was already planning his next wedding. He had proposed to Jane before the trial even started. He knew the verdict because he had ordered it. And Cromwell? He had followed the script, word for word, lie for lie. Anne watched it unfold, stone-faced, not because she accepted it, but because she understood it. She was no longer on trial. The system was, and it had failed. No physical evidence, no living witnesses, Only rumors. Only paper. Only silence. Still, she stood, tall, dignified, alone. The charges were read. The accusations spat like venom. Adultery. With 5 men, including her own brother. The room held its breath. She denied it all. Calmly, quietly, powerfully. But denial meant nothing. Not when the king had moved on. Not when a new crown waited. For a new bride. The Duke of Norfolk, her uncle, spoke the words, guilty, sentenced to death, to be burned or beheaded. At the king's pleasure, she bowed her head, not in shame, but in disbelief. Outside the court, commoners whispered. Even they could see. This was not justice. This was theater. Behind the curtain, the actors bowed. Henry smiled. The throne was ready for Jane, and the execution was just another formality. Anne was no longer a wife, or a queen, or a woman. She was a warning to anyone who rose without permission. And while Anne awaited death, the king rehearsed for another wedding night. It wasn't a courtroom. It was a stage. Not for justice, but for performance. On May 15th, Anne Boleyn stood trial, not as a queen, but as an example of what happens when power is questioned. No lawyer, no defense, no chance. She wasn't told the full charges. Until the trial began, she wasn't allowed to call witnesses, or speak in full, or breathe without judgment. The jury, handpicked, stacked with enemies. Her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presided, and would soon speak the words that ended her life. Among the jurors, Charles Brandon, who once called her a goggle-eyed whore. Henry Percy, the man Anne once loved, but was forced to leave. And the most haunting of all, relatives of Jane Seymour. Yes, Jane, the woman Henry would marry. Just 11 days after Anne's execution. This wasn't justice. It was rehearsal. And now, the twist. While Anne stood in court, defending her life, Henry was already planning his next wedding. He had proposed to Jane before the trial even started. He knew the verdict because he had ordered it. And Cromwell? He had followed the script, word for word, lie for lie. Anne watched it unfold, stone-faced, not because she accepted it, but because she understood it. She was no longer on trial. The system was, and it had failed. No physical evidence, no living witnesses, only rumors, only paper, only silence. Still, she stood, tall, dignified, alone. The charges were read. The accusations spat like venom. Adultery. With 5 men, including her own brother. The room held its breath. She denied it all. Calmly, quietly, powerfully. But denial meant nothing. Not when the king had moved on. Not when a new crown waited. For a new bride. The Duke of Norfolk, her uncle, spoke the words, guilty, sentenced to death, to be burned or beheaded. At the king's pleasure, she bowed her head, not in shame, but in disbelief. Outside the court, commoners whispered. Even they could see. This was not justice. This was theater. Behind the curtain, the actors bowed. Henry smiled. The throne was ready for Jane, and the execution was just another formality. Anne was no longer a wife, or a queen, or a woman. She was a warning to anyone who rose without permission. And while Anne awaited death, the king rehearsed for another wedding night. It was done. Anne Boleyn was gone, but death didn't bring dignity. They hadn't prepared a coffin, not even a simple box. The Queen of England had no grave waiting, no priest, no prayers, no farewell. Her ladies wept, shaking, shocked, broken. They wrapped her in white cloth, head and body, both. Then, they searched the tower, looking for something, anything. What they found was an old arrow chest, a wooden box used for carrying weapons, That became her coffin. Rough, stained, unfit. But it was all they had, or all they allowed. They laid her inside, quietly, quickly, and then they buried her. In the chapel of Street Peter ad Vincula. No marker, no stone, no name. As if she had never existed. The woman who wore a crown was buried like a threat. Not a queen, but a problem solved. No courtier spoke. No bishop prayed. No poet mourned her name. And yet, far from the tower, a little girl cried. Elizabeth, just 2 years old. Too young to understand, but not too young to feel absent. As she grew, she heard whispers, rumors, lies. Her mother, a traitor, an adulteress, a warning. But Elizabeth never forgot. Not in secret. She kept a ring, wore it every day, until her death. Inside it, 2 portraits, face to face, hers and Anne's peepwork. She also kept her mother's book of hours, her jewelry, her falcon badge, hidden in her palaces. A silent tribute to a woman the world tried to erase. And one day, after watching another stepmother be executed, Elizabeth made a promise. I will never marry. She kept that vow. For life, the Virgin Queen was born in the ashes of her mother's death, not crowned in celebration, but in survival, not out of joy, but fear. And under every royal decision, Anne's memory lingered. The girl who watched her mother disappear grew into a woman who never let anyone in. But the tower wasn't finished. Anne's ghost was just beginning to rise. Anne Boleyn died in 1536, but she never really left. Not the tower, not the throne, not England. Her ghost wasn't in chains. It walked freely through the halls of power, through the soul of her daughter, Elizabeth. She rose, not in her mother's shadow, but through it, England's Virgin Queen, unmarried, unbending, unforgiving. She ruled for 45 years, longer than her father, stronger than his legacy, and colder than the sword that killed her mother. She wore the crown, but never the veil, because she knew what love could cost. She had seen it. On a scaffold, she watched others fall, queens, wives, sisters, but she never let herself become one. Every decision she made echoed with memory. Every signature on a death warrant shook her hand. She delayed executions, questioned trials, feared the moment she would become what her father was. When Parliament demanded Mary, Queen of Scots, be executed, Elizabeth waited, stalled, trembled, and when she finally signed, she claimed she was tricked. Some say it was politics. I say it was the voice of a dead woman, whispering in her ear. Anne was never declared innocent, but Elizabeth made sure she was never forgotten. Not in stone, not in gold, but in legacy. The ghost lived in mirrors, in choices, in silence, and in one ring, tightly worn, until death. But Anne's death didn't just shape a queen. It reshaped the law and exposed the lie that justice was blind, that kings ruled with divine right, that the courtroom was sacred. Anne proved otherwise. She was proof that power needs no evidence, just obedience, that when truth is inconvenient, it gets buried next to bodies, in arrow chests, and that kind of ghost doesn't haunt towers. It haunts systems, courts, governments. It haunts us. Because Anne's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a message that when fear replaces fact, when silence replaces resistance, and when verdicts are written before trials begin, justice dies. Just as surely as the woman on the scaffold, her blood stained the stones. But her story cracked the throne. Anne Boleyn was executed, but she was never defeated, because in the end, she gave England something no one expected. A daughter, a survivor, a monarch who wore her pain like armor and ruled with the strength of silence. The sword killed the queen, but the ghost she left behind built an empire